What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5. So this time around I'm going to be digging into the live histogram to basically, well, see how it ticks. Now a word of warning in advance, this is going to be a fairly long video. Well, you probably already know that since you saw the time code on it. Now, as with most of these videos, much of what I'm going to be covering also applies to the R5's sister cameras, including the R, the R6, and the R3. And in fact, as best as I can tell, the underlying code that goes into creating the live histogram is pretty much the same across all of Canon's cameras, so the M series, Canon's DSLRs in live view, and of course the EOS R mirrorless cameras. However, with all that said, I own and use an EOS R5, so that's where this video is focused, and that's what I've done all my testing on. Consequently, if you use one of the other R-series cameras, your camera may behave differently from what I'm demonstrating, but it should be pretty close. So in this video, I'm going to cover three major areas. First is where the live histogram appears to get its data from and why it won't always reflect the final image's histogram. In fact, in the details, it probably never will reflect the final image's histogram. Second is what image processing settings the camera has that affect the histogram and how they affect it. And then finally, I'll dive into some measurements comparing what the histogram shows on the screen to where the file levels or where the data is in the actual files themselves. Now, before I get into the testing, I want to start by talking about what you need to do to activate the live histogram if for some reason you can't find it or it's not on your camera. Now, it should be on by default in the third info screen for the rear LCD and the third info screen for the viewfinder. Now, if it's not there, there are two settings that control whether or not it will be displayed. First is exposure simulation, and this must be set to enabled. Now you'll find this on the Shoot 7 menu page, and by default this should be set to enabled, but if you've changed it or whatnot, you will need to change it, and I keep saying this, to enabled. Now I make this point very clear because there is also a setting in the exposure simulation for during depth of field preview. And this will do an exposure simulation while you hold down the depth of field preview button. However, if you have this selected, even when you hold down the depth of field preview button, the histogram will not be activated. So secondly, you will also need to enable the histogram on each of the shooting information screens that you want it to appear on. Now you'll find these settings in the shooting info settings and viewfinder info / toggle settings menus. These are under the shooting info display menu on the Shoot 7 menu page. Now I've covered this in customizing these in another video, and I will put a link to the description instead of making this video even longer. So now that we've got the histogram up, let's talk about where the data comes from and what the limitations are, and as a result, why the live histogram won't exactly match the review histogram. So the obvious source for the live histogram's data is the exposure simulated live view image. Now, consequently, there are several reasons that you can expect the live and review histograms to differ. So to start with, the live view image is lower resolution than the final image will be. Now, I can't, or haven't, I should say, been able to determine the specifics of what the resolution and how the live view is running, but the short of it is that a lot of resolution really isn't necessary. The highest resolution display on the camera is the EVF, and that's only an 1800 by 1200 pixel display. Metering only requires enough information for a 384 zone, for the 384 zones, and for subject detection, given that Canon DSLRs could do face detection with a 15,000 or 150,000 pixel RGB metering sensor, that's more than enough resolution than is needed for subject detection to work. So as a consequence of all of this, the final histogram will almost assuredly have more pixels that cover more fine details, which means that there's going to be more brightness levels in the pixels or that it covers, and so the details will be different between the review and the live histogram. Now, secondly, the live histograms exposure is simulated. Now, this is pretty good, but the devil here is in the details, and it's not immediately clear, again, to me, how Canon is going about doing this. Are they doing it digitally? Are they doing it analog? You know, what exactly the long and the short of it is. So, for instance, one method they could use is that when the selected exposure settings, so your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, reflect what the camera can actually do for the live view, then the camera uses those settings to generate the live view image. And this, of course, would produce the most accurate simulation, since it's basically the image that you would be shooting. And of course, in many cases, the camera can't match the exposure the exposure settings for a variety of reasons. And in those cases, which is probably going to be the majority of cases, the simulated exposure may not match the actual exposure exactly. Now, additionally, the live image doesn't include all of the image adjustments that the camera is capable of. So picture styles, white balance, and simple lens corrections like vignetting are done to the live image stream. However, more complicated processing, specifically clarity and digital lens optimizer, are not. So if you use those last two settings, then you will have more significant difference between your image, or between the live and the review histogram. Now, further, Canon's cameras meter and focus with the aperture wide open. So anytime you have selected a shooting aperture that's smaller than wide open, that will require the camera to simulate the exposure using different exposure settings than what the camera would be set for to make that final image. Now, of course, this has a further side effect, or side effects, that some changes from the aperture can't be simulated, or aren't completely simulated, or simulated with 100% accuracy. So, for example, vignetting correction, which is corrected in the live view image, is not always completely corrected. Further, if you're using a filter that vignettes slightly, that additional vignetting won't be corrected for at all, because the camera has no way to know how to correct for it or what to correct for, but stopping down can reduce that or remove it completely. Now finally, since the lens is kept wide open for metering, focusing, and the live view image creation, if the selected shooting aperture is smaller than that, obviously that changes depth of field and the bokeh. And as a result, the distribution of brightness levels in out of focus areas will change. So you'll have sharper background details. They will minimize the amount of blur that's there, which will concentrate the light into fewer pixels, shifting the histogram. And of course, the result of this is going to be some minor changes to the review or the final histogram compared to the live histogram. Now that said, most of these errors can either be checked for, if you're that inclined to do so, before shooting by using depth of field preview, where the camera will stop down and will continue to display the histogram, or simply aren't significant enough to be a problem in a way that affects the utility of the histogram as an exposure judging tool. Okay, so with that stuff out of the way, let's get to the testing. So first, I want to start with a qualitative look at some of the settings that affect the live histogram. Now, primarily, these are going to be picture style and its subsettings, such as contrast, saturation, and tone, as well as white balance and lens corrections, specifically vignetting correction. So we'll start with the picture styles. Now, the first picture here is a histogram using the standard picture style. In the second histogram, I've changed the picture style to neutral. And in this final histogram, I have the picture style set to landscape. Now, the difference between these aren't tremendously huge, but there are differences. Most noticeably, you can see the differences in where the extreme highlights and shadows fall due to changes in contrast. And since contrast is easily the most noticeable factor in changes in the histogram, let's take a look at that a bit more closely. So here I have 3 more images. These were all taken using the neutral picture style. However, with this time, the first picture here has the contrast set to 0, then to -4, and finally to +4. Now, what we see here is that changing the picture style's contrast affects the histogram, as we would expect, and it also affects it the way we would expect of contrast, which is to either widen or contract the overall width of the histogram so that it, as a result of contrast. So increasing contrast causes the brights to be brighter and the darks to be darker, while decreasing contrast causes everything to be less extreme. Next, let's take a look at white balance. So again, here we're looking at something that's roughly balanced to white balance to neutral, now to too cool of a white balance, and finally too warm of a white balance. And yep, for these tests, we can see the red, blue, and green channels shift around significantly, as we would expect, as the white balance is changed. Additionally, since the white balance does affect the live histogram, you can use the white balance, or you can use the histogram to adjust the white balances of your image. All you need is to use the RGB histogram instead of the brightness histogram, and then select a suitably neutral subject that has enough information in the frame to have a discernible spike in the histogram, and then align using the white balance and white balance fine-tuning controls, align the spikes in the red, green, and blue channels so that they are all vertically stacked. Now, this isn't the best way to do white balancing, but it does work. Finally, let's take a quick look at lens aberration corrections. So here I am simply switching peripheral illumination correction from enabled to disabled. And as you can see, the histogram responds to the changes. The periphery becoming lighter reduces the amount of information that's in the shadows, or shifts the shadows of the histogram. Now that said, aside from vignetting, the other lens corrections don't have a significant enough change, or don't create a significant enough change to the image to have an appreciable effect or impact on the histogram itself. Now, whether these demonstrations matter a whole lot or not to you depends a lot on how you use the histogram and the information that, or the image format that you shoot in. So if you're a JPEG user, what this is showing is that aside from, again, Digital Lens Optimizer and Clarity, you can reasonably count on the live histogram to broadly reflect what you can expect to see in your final images. Now, if you're a RAW shooter, the most useful takeaway from all of this is that you can tweak certain settings to potentially make the histogram better reflect the RAW levels that you're recording, and at least that's assuming your goal in using the histogram in the camera is to understand RAW levels and ultimately avoid RAW clipping. So with the basic stuff out of the way, let's look at some more advanced testing to see how the live histogram actually relates to the resulting images, especially the RAW files. So these tests all use an 18% gray card lit with an Aperture Lightstorm LS120D Mark II at 100% output at about 5-foot distance. The lighting and metering were checked and adjusted using a Sekonic L308XU light meter, and the RAW and JPEG values were analyzed from a central 200 by 200 pixel crop using a combination of LibRaw, ImageMagick, and NumPy in Python to calculate the average values and statistics. Now, all that said, while I've made every attempt to keep things accurate and consistent, the reality is I don't have an optical lab, this isn't an optical bench, and none of this is really that precise. In fact, you can even note in some of the respects that the camera's meter is only good for 1/3 of a stop accuracy in terms of its measurement. Now, all that said, in repeating tests, if I had to change setups or something to that effect, I would verify that my meter readings were correct and then would check values in a RAW file to ensure that they were consistently within the expected errors for noise and metering accuracy. So on to the testing. And I want to start by looking at how the meter relates to the histogram and in turn to the JPEG and RAW file data. So first off, I wanted to see where the nominal exposure falls in both the histogram and the file data. Now for this, I used my incident meter to determine what the nominal exposure for my lighting setup should be. Then I set the camera to those settings and verified that with the spot meter on the gray card, the meter indicator in the camera was centered.
Now, looking at the live and review histograms, we see a spike in the center of the histogram from the gray card. We can also see that the review histogram is subtly different from the live one, even though both are rendered the same size by the camera, so it's probably not a scaling factor. Now, what's noticeable is that the gray card spike in the review histogram is definitely wider than in the live. Now, this is probably due to the aforementioned differences in resolution that the camera has to work with between the live image, which would be very low resolution, and in this case, the 17 megapixel final image, which obviously is going to have much higher resolution. Now, the green values, and for raw values, green values are the most important ones to look at due to the attenuation of the green color filters being the lowest of the three in the camera, and therefore the green values will be the first values to clip when they're exposed to bright conditions. The green values in the ISO 100 RAW file averaged 1834, which works out to be 11.1%. Now, this is just over half a stop under 18%, so it's a bit lower than you would expect for a 1/6 stop error. The JPEG file, on the other hand, averaged 127, which gamma correcting for a 2.2 gamma, which is what I'm figuring based on sRGB or Adobe RGB, comes out to around 20%, which is in fact about a sixth of a stop above 18% and within the margin of error of a third stop metering range. Now, either way, the 18% spike is in the middle of the histogram. Now, in theory, 18% should be 2.5 stops below 100%, or it is 2.5 stops below, or just under 2.5 stops below 100%. And that 100% is obviously when the pixels are fully saturated or clipping. Instead, what we see are in the RGB values is, at least in the raw file, the metering point produces an image that, or produces levels that are much closer to 12%, actually just under 12%, which would be just over 3 stops below the clipping point. Now, that said, since clipping results in the unrecoverable loss of image information, and that is not desirable, more highlight headroom in a digital file is definitely a good thing. Of course, the real lesson here is that the entire metering process, that is mapping real-world light levels to the camera's exposure and then figuring out how to fit that into the file or where that should fit into the file, is actually pretty complex and maybe should warrant its own video with its own in-depth kind of discussion and investigation. That might be something for the future. So we know that with the meter centered, we see a histogram spike in the center of the histogram's graph. So the next question I think warrants consideration then is, how is the x-axis of the histogram laid out? Is it linear? Is it logarithmic? Does it use a gamma curve? And if so, what kind or which one? So we'll start by looking at the bright end of the histogram. And to do this, I've increased the exposure in 1-stop steps up to 3 stops. Now, it takes 3 stops to get the gray card spike to push right up against the right edge of the histogram under these conditions. Now, you may notice that it's not completely against the right edge either. It's not fully clipping. Further, we see something similar in the review histogram, even though the gray card is covered by the dreaded blinkies. Now, that may indicate that the blinkies actually have a small amount of margin for what's going on, or that pixels are clipping and that enough pixels actually are clipping in the gray card to cause the camera to trigger the blinkies in the review image. This also confirms the premise that the camera's metering constant is really around 12% and not 18%, and as a result, JPEGs would have somewhere around 3 stops of highlight headroom. Not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, there's been a lot of discussion of various forums about digital cameras using 12 or 12.5% instead of 18% as film cameras have historically done. Now we can turn our attention towards the dark side of the histogram and black. Now, the first thing to notice is that the darkest section of the histogram doesn't quite behave the same as the rest. As the histogram gets into the very darkest levels, the distance the spikes move between stops decreases dramatically. Now, one confounding factor here is that contrast is part of the picture style, and that contrast stretches the extremes of the histogram. Now, this is The tests done so far have used a neutral picture style and the contrast set to 0. Of course, this doesn't mean that there is no contrast curve being applied, only that the picture style's inbuilt contrast curve isn't being modified in camera. Now to look at this, I repeated the previous tests, but this time with the picture styles contrast set to -4. Increasing the exposure 3 stops, and the first thing we can see is the impact of contrast on the histogram. The first stop jump, in fact, all of the stop jumps aren't nearly as wide as they were when the contrast was set to 0. And in fact, this is very clearly obvious at the 1/6 of a second setting, where the spike is now over the rightmost grid line or grid separator instead of being nearly halfway between it and the right edge. At +3 stops, the image isn't clipping, and the histogram is slightly off from the right edge, more so than it was at 0 contrast. Though pushing the camera to 3 1/3 stop does cause the histogram to clip. Now, going the other way, looking at black,
The 1/100th of a second exposure
is right on the leftmost grid line as opposed to being nearly halfway between it and the left edge as it was in the 0 contrast test. Now, raw data for these tests was the same as the previous test, or within the limits of error, and that's as it should be, as contrast is not modified or does not modify the raw data in the files. But now the histogram does slightly better reflect the actual headroom that is available in the ISO 100 raw file. So what does this tell us about mapping of the histogram to the brightness values, the question we set out to ask or answer? First off, the grid lines on the histogram don't seem to mean anything specific. At best, and this is how I think of them, they should be thought of as representing blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites, sort of broader concepts going from left to right and not specific numbers. Even then, I'm not sure that's quite the best way to think about things either. In any event, they certainly don't correspond, at least not obviously, to a specific number of stops or some direct numerical increment. Secondly, the axis is not linear. It appears to use a gamma curve, and my guess is that it uses the same gamma curve as the selected color space on your camera, so either sRGB or Adobe RGB. However, the difference between those two color spaces and their gamma curves, Adobe RGB is purely gamma 2.2, sRGB has a modified gamma 2.2 curve, is only discernible at the lowest brightness levels. And given how compressed the histogram is on the camera, especially in that range, it's probably impossible to determine the specifics of the histogram just by looking at the histogram in the image on the camera. So with that taken care of, let's compare the live and review histograms at a few different brightness levels. And we'll start with an exposure or brightness level of just under 8 EV. Now, this is reasonably bright. It's not super bright, it's not outside bright. I get a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second at f2.8 ISO 100 on the gray card, with the gray card in the meter being centered. Now, if we think of live view as video, then in order to support a 30 frame per second frame rate, you would need a shutter speed of at least 1/30th of a second. And to get that, you would need a third stop boost in gain over what the camera is currently set at. To support a 60 frame per second frame rate, you need a 60th of a second shutter speed, and that would require at least a 1 1/3 stop boost in ISO on the camera. So effectively, we're talking about the sensor having to use ISOs 125 and 250 respectively. Now, in practice, it's likely that the camera would use a higher ISO, as it probably needs time to read extra information from the sensor, such as for autofocus, but we're still probably talking less than an ISO 400 or the equivalent for this situation. Now, the point here is that these settings are all fairly low gains, and they're not terribly high compared to the selected shooting ISO of 100, and that broadly these should all have fairly similar noise performances and dynamic range, which would in turn minimize the overall impact on the histogram for these situations. And broadly under these conditions, the live and review histograms aren't so different that the ISO or gain appears to make that much of a difference. Now, that said, there are some differences. Most notably, again, the spikes in the review histogram are wider than they were in the live histogram, even though, again, the graphs are drawn at the same width. However, this could easily be a result, again, of simply having more data from the full resolution file to work with, therefore there's more intermediate values. Also, the review image potentially has more processing done to it in the form of clarity or digital lens optimizer. However, that's not the case in these images, as neither of those settings were enabled for these tests. But on a similar vein, the actual processing that is done in all images, so the picture styles, lens corrections, etc., may also be being done at different intensities or different levels of completeness due to the hard real-time requirements of the live view image versus a slightly more relaxed requirement for the review image or final image. So now let's take a look at what happens when the scene brightness is significantly lower. To accomplish this, I used a 6-stop neutral density filter to simulate the lower light level without having to compromise the lighting intensity for the test setup. Now, I chose to go this route instead of simply dimming the lights to minimize the errors from external sources, such as reflections or a computer monitor going to sleep or something like that in the room that could cause changes to the exposure, as I had seen impacts of this in various cases during the original test setup. So in theory, where the previous tests, the camera could have used an ISO for the live view of around 400 or below, now the camera would have to use an ISO somewhere in the 8,000 range, give or take, at least assuming it's still maintaining 30 frames per second in the viewfinder. Now, however, for this test, the shooting ISO is still set to 100. So you can imagine this kind of thing as simulating the kind of situation you might be in, say, shooting a dusk landscape or night architectural photography, or a situation in low light where you don't necessarily need to have high shutter speeds to freeze action, but you want to get the most out of your images from a noise and dynamic range perspective. So let's look at the test. Starting with the zero bias point, increasing the exposure plus 3 stops, and decreasing the exposure to minus 6 stops. Now, to be completely honest about it, I'm actually both surprised and impressed here. The live and review histograms are, at least in the big picture sense, almost spot on. There are a few differences, but they are relatively minor. So, for instance, in the minus 6 EV test frame, there's actually an extra spike in the darks that's likely due to the gray card and the fact that the ISO 100 file or gain has enough dynamic range to be able to distinguish the gray card from the black background. And that's discernible, of course, in the review histogram because of the settings that was shot at and the resolution that it has, but isn't in the live histogram where the camera is obviously running at lower resolution and or lower dynamic range. There's also a slight shift in the blue channel that I can't quite explain specifically, but may have something to do with differences in the gain due to stronger attenuation that the blue color filters have, and so they would need to have a higher amplification, which in turn causes noise and so on and so forth. However, both of these differences are relatively minor compared to the overall, or at least in the overall scheme of things. So, what can we take away from all of this? Well, quite simply, if you shoot JPEG, I think it's safe to trust the live histogram to reflect what you should see in your final images, at least well enough that it's a viable tool for making exposure-based decisions. If you're a raw shooter, well, we're going to dig into the details in the next part. So with the live versus review histogram stuff out of the way, let's take a look at the meaty part, at least if you're a raw shooter. And that's how the live histogram compares to what you will see in your raw files. Of course, anybody who shoots raw knows that the JPEG histogram doesn't necessarily or accurately reflect the data in their raw files. This is one of the reasons that raw shooters have always tended to use very flat picture styles and generally turn down the contrast as much as possible in an effort to get the clipping in the JPEG to match when the raw data actually clips. So starting at ISO 100 and basically rewinding to the first set of tests, but looking at the raw data as opposed to comparative histogram information, we look at the 0 meter reading and highlight headroom. With the contrast on the camera set to 0 and the meter zeroed, the first green channel in my raw file averaged at 1834, with the red and blue channels coming in at 1246 and 1171 respectively. Now remember, I said the green channel will always be brighter than the red and blue channels due to the attenuation in the color filters. Now this equates to 11.1% or 3.2 stops below white in the green channel, and this is very near the 12% mark that's often quoted as being the metering constant for digital cameras. Increasing the exposure 3 stops, which has the highlight headroom pushing, or has the histogram. Increasing the exposure 3 stops, which has the histogram pushing up against the right edge of the histogram spike pushing up against the right edge, produced an average green channel value of 11,242, which is 68% of the maximum value, or just over a half stop below clipping. The red and blue channels are even lower at 6,467 and 5,849, respectively. Even the JPEG file here averaged values of 252, which is 99% of the maximum. So not quite clipping, but close enough that there's basically no headroom here either. Now, as for the raw files, the clipping point is about a half stop further, so you have more headroom before you clip. And of course, we see that with the plus 3 1/3 stop or 3 1/3 stop exposures. So at -6 stops, the raw values for the green channel averaged 534 and the JPEG was at 3. Now I have to make a brief side here on Canon's raw files. Canons are a little weird compared to potentially the rest of the industry if you're not expecting it. Canon has chosen to offset the black levels in their raw files from 0. So on the R5, this means that pure black, which for most camera brands would be 0, is actually at 512 or some higher number, but 512 for ISO 100. Setting the contrast to -4, of course, doesn't have any effect on the raw values, but it does alter the histogram. And this time, pushing the exposure up 3 stops shows a much bigger margin before clipping in the histogram, and pushing up the exposure a further 3rd stop causes the live histogram and review image to show clipping, which we saw. However, the raw file average value for the green channel here is 14,028. This is still 2,000 and change digital units away from actually clipping, or a value of around 86% of the maximum file, or maximum value. That's just under a quarter of a stop below clipping. Now the short of it is that if you configure your camera to use the neutral picture style and lower the contrast all the way to -4, you should still have a touch of headroom, at least at ISO 100, before the raw file clips. As ISO increases, of course, so does noise, and we've already seen that the live histogram could pretty accurately reflect changes in ISO previously, but let's just double check to see how that applies to raw files. So for this test, I continued with the neutral picture style and the contrast set to -4. Now the R5's base ISO range is 9 stops, ranging from 100 at the bottom to 51,200 at the top. So for this second test, I chose ISO 3200 as that sits right smack dab in the middle of the ISO range. With the meter zeroed and the histogram spike shows up roughly in the center, and I get an average of 3,425 for the raw's green channel. Now this translates to approximately 20% of the maximum value, though with the floating black levels, that's not quite accurate either. However, increasing the exposure by 3 stops did not result in clipping the live histogram, and the RAW's green channel was at 12,850, or about 78% of clipping, giving us about 0.35 stops of headroom compared to what we had at in the ISO 100 RAW file. Pushing the exposure up another third stop absolutely clips the histogram and results in green channel values of 15,575. This is 95% of the clipping point, leaving less than a tenth of a stop of headroom compared to the quarter stop of headroom that we had at ISO 100 at the same settings. So, put simply, it looks like you can rely on the live histogram to predict clipping in RAW files at least up to ISO 3200 as well, but there is going to be less headroom compared to what you had in ISO 100. So that's good news for us RAW shooters. Now, for the sake of completeness, let's take a look at 6 stops under the nominal exposure just to see what's going on, even though it's not tremendously relevant from a clipping perspective. So due to the combination of ISO and shutter speed and not wanting to change the aperture for these tests, I used my 6-stop neutral density filter to drop the exposure for this test. So for this, I got raw values of 2067 on the green channel. Now, for a point of reference, pure black at this ISO has a black level of 2048. Remember, Canon files float the black level. Finally, I also wanted to repeat the last set of tests, or this set of tests, at ISO 51200 to see how the camera behaves at the very top end. So for this test, I did go back to using the 6-stop ND filter to get shutter speeds in a somewhat workable range. Even then, I didn't get the -6 EV shot. Instead, it's only 5 1/3 stops below normal or nominal. So with the meter zeroed on the gray card with an exposure of 1/2000th f2.8 ISO 51200, I saw green channel values around 3,351, or around 20% of clipping. Pushing up 3 EV gave a green channel value of around 12,545, or 76% of clipping. And at -5.3 EV, I got green channel values around 2087, or 12.7% of clipping. Now, of course, the big difference here is the standard deviation due to noise. And we see this when we compare the live and review histograms too, where the live histogram presents fairly small but defined spikes. The review histogram has spikes that are significantly wider simply due to noise. At least that's very much the case in the mids and the shadows. The interesting one is the bright peak in the +3 EV exposure remains fairly tight for whatever reason. So let's talk about the big takeaway from this, which is that while the live histogram may not exactly reflect the final or review histogram in the details, it's close enough that it's still extremely useful for the photographer to use for exposure decisions. Of course, the most relevant aspect to this, at least in my opinion, is how the histogram relates to the raw file's clipping points, or really any file's clipping points. Now, in the past, I've known some raw shooters that have gone to extreme lengths, including building custom picture styles that attempted to accurately reflect the sensor gains for the various color channels and so on. Now, this approach created completely useless preview images, but at least in very limited circumstances for them, the histogram was spot on. Now, of course, on a DSLR, this wasn't a problem since the viewfinder is optical and therefore no processing is applied to it, but this really isn't a practical approach in the mirrorless world anymore, where such a picture style would render your viewfinder a Technicolor nightmare. That said, if you shoot JPEG, you can pretty easily rely on the live histogram to tell you what to expect from the exposures and your images. Now, of course, there will be differences, but on the whole, those differences should be in the details and not in the big picture. Now, the same really also applies to raw shooters as well, with the added benefit that if you are shooting raw, you'll almost always have a small amount of headroom over what the live histogram indicates. So it's pretty much a win all around, and I'm quite impressed. Now, that said, digging into things I always find interesting is I end up learning something that I wasn't completely prepared for in the process. And in this case, that's been the case several times over. However, the big one out of this whole adventure is that I didn't really expect the simulated histogram to be as accurate or useful as it is. I expected to see much more in the way of limitations, especially when I was pushing the cameras to extremes, so very dark environments or something to that effect. Of course, this is one of the benefits of actual testing and why I actually recommend photographers take their cameras, set up controlled conditions, and test things that they're unsure of instead of just hoping that somebody has an answer for them online. Now, my perception of all of this came from my actual shooting. And in field conditions, one of the problems is that it's very hard to repeat the exact scene over and over. Even if you have a camera on a tripod, things in the environment will change. And so when I was shooting and testing things, I would take a picture, I would look at the histogram, I would go back and look at the live histogram. They would be reasonably completely different, but the truth is I didn't actually have the camera pointed at exactly the same composition. So with all of that said, I'm going to wrap this one up here. If you found this interesting or informative, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. Also, if you know someone else who might find this useful, help them and me by sharing it with them. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.